AntMan and the Wasp Quantumania finally releases this week in theaters, and with that said, we now have 5 MCU trilogies for 5 different pair of heroes. Now, this will not include the Avengers because Avengers has Infinity War and Endgame. That's a two-parter, so that kind of makes it not really a trilogy. But we are having Thor, Iron Man, Ant-Man and the Wasp, Captain America, and of course Spider-Man in here. So with that said, make sure to leave your thoughts down below. What would your ranking be of the MCU trilogies? And with that said, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button for more Marvel content like this on a daily basis. But let's get into this rank. Number 5 is the Thor Trilogy. If you've watched me for quite a while, you probably knew that this one was going to end up here. I'm not a huge fan of this Thor Trilogy. I like the character of Thor, but I think he works better as a team than anything else. And I think out of this entire trilogy, 2 of these films are pretty low on my MCU ranking when it comes down to rewatchability. And one of them's almost in the mid-tier, but this is just one of those films that it definitely got better by Thor Ragnarok, but that's only to a certain extent. And honestly, the best thing about Thor Ragnarok, though, is the character development that they gave Chris Hemsworth's Thor. That way, when we go into Infinity War, there's this added development there that I honestly really liked, and I can actually give a little bit of like love to that part from Thor Ragnarok. And I think Thor Ragnarok is the most fun out of all of these. It's the most colorful, it's the most enjoyable. Thor the Dark World is the worst MCU film in my opinion. It's dull, it's drag, it's almost unrewatchable. And I'm not saying that as it's just a terrible made movie. It's just a very boring film to watch that I don't care to rewatch it when I'm going through my MCU rankings or just in general when I'm going back and just having fun and deciding what MCU film do I want to watch again. I never say Thor the Dark World. Go back to the first film, which again has a great father, son, and brother story between Thor, Loki, and Odin that I think is very Shakespearean, and honestly the way that Kenneth Branagh directed that movie is some of the most spectacular stuff that we've seen in the MCU. But again, with that movie, we're barely in Asgard. Most of it takes place on Earth, and everything on Earth just really drags out for me personally. I have to look at all these trilogies. This one definitely hits last place for me. Up to my number 4, this one was actually tough to start shifting if it was going to be at my 3 or my 4, and I ended up going with my 4th spot after doing a rewatch of everything. And at my number 4 is the Iron Man trilogy. Now, overall, if you look at the consistency of Iron Man's character in the MCU, that is a very important thing. Iron Man 1, Iron Man 2, and Iron Man 3. Now, Iron Man 2 is kind of like that one that's trying to build up the Avengers and set up a little bit too many things, so we don't really love that one, but I do love the first Iron Man film. I love what's set up there, and specifically what it's set up with what Tony Stark's main mission is, becoming Iron Man. And then going to Iron Man 3, while some of the character development there feels like it was thrown out of the door, specifically in Age of Ultron, I actually do think that a lot of that representation on what he learned and what he learned as a character does continue from Age of Ultron, specifically and continuing all the way down to Endgame, where he makes his final sacrifice, which is one thing that I really love in what they were able to do with this trilogy. It mostly just comes down to consistency. I think the first Iron Man is what birthed the MCU. It is an incredibly made movie, and I love the origin story to that. Iron Man 2 is quite a mess. It can be fun at times, but it's just overall just one of those films I just don't like to rewatch. And Iron Man 3 I think is actually quite underrated. I like that it's more about Tony Stark himself than actually Iron Man. And again, what this trilogy is able to set up going forward into other movies, specifically like one of my favorite arcs is in Civil War, that is where I really much appreciate it. But we're talking about his trilogy, those 3 main films, not exactly every other film. So while it does great setup there, there's still a lot of things that I have issues with within the trilogy itself. My number 3 is the Ant-Man and the Wasp Trilogy. We now just got Quantumania, and overall I found this one to be kind of just in the middle of all the other things that I'm ranking. And I say that because I'm a big fan of this Ant-Man character. I love Scott Lang, and I love the first Ant-Man film. I love how small scale it is. I love the heist element to it. It very much was a palate cleanser after Avengers Age of Ultron. Just like Ant-Man and the Wasp, when that came out, that was a great palate cleanser to Avengers Infinity War. But now we have Quantumania, which is actually going to be kicking off Phase 5, and specifically really much introducing Kang the Conqueror. I know, yes, Kang has been technically introduced in Loki. Not everyone watched Loki. So there's going to be a chance that a lot more people are going to see this film for the first time and be introduced to not just the multiverse, but also Kang himself. The trilogy itself, if you do see it, you'll notice that, like, yes, technically there's not really a consistent basis to, like, what the story is or maybe a character arc, but what there is there's this family element that is consistent throughout it all. Looking out for the little guy and that father-daughter relationship between Scott Lang and Cassie Lang. And honestly, that is the biggest through line through each and every film, and specifically the relationship that grows and the family that Scott makes grows throughout this all. And specifically in Quantumania, we see that pay off as this Ant-Man team, which is something that I honestly really loved. I didn't love Quantumania. I love the first Ant-Man. I quite enjoy Ant-Man and the Wasp. I think Quantumania is better than Ant-Man and the Wasp, but there's still quite a few issues with it. I just find it to be a really good movie. I don't even know really good, but it's a good, fun movie. But I do love that even though how big and bombastic Quantumania can get, how absurd it can even get at times, it's still at the heart of it remains an Ant-Man film. Down to the humor, down to the characters, down to the story, and down to its thematic. I personally felt that that was the best aspect of this trilogy, and I love how consistent it was throughout it all. So, with that said, it takes the middle of the road. On my number 2, we have Captain America's Trilogy. Now, I freaking love Chris Evans in this role, and I love a majority of these movies, specifically Winter Soldier. Winter Soldier is the top 3 best MCU films ever. I just cannot get enough of that movie, and I think it's so spectacular. My thing with Captain America is kind of the same thing with Tony Stark. A lot of the big arc moments for Captain America really suffice in another Avengers film, which is something that, like, the same thing that we see within Thor. Lots of setup in this trilogy for this character, but we don't really get that payoff in the trilogy, whereas, like, in Ant-Man, and of course the other one that I'm going to talk about, we get a lot of payoff in their trilogy. Captain America itself, you have the first film, which is a fantastic origin story, and you really get this build-up of who Steve Rogers is as a character. That segues us into the Avengers, which technically does not count in this trilogy ranking, and then after the first Avengers, we segue into Winter Soldier. Now, Winter Soldier and Civil War are very heavily connected, specifically because of the Hydra element, the government wanting to come in and kind of control superheroes and decide what they do and what they don't do, and I overall thought that was one of the most fascinating elements of Civil War. Now, I wanted a little bit more stakes when it came down to that entire film. I understand that kind of what it leads into an Avengers Infinity War is very important, but in that film, it feels like there should have been a death, and that doesn't really go against this film trilogy because I mostly am just looking at Captain America's story, but as someone who just really digs this trilogy, the first film's a great start to it all, but the next 2 films are even more powerful, and specifically poignant in the way that they're talking about the character. That, for me, is one of the most important parts about this trilogy, is the way that it establishes each and every one of those elements. And overall, what can I say? Captain America is a fantastic trilogy, and I think a lot of you guys are probably going to have this at your number 1. But what is my number 1? You guys can probably guess what it is, but come on. It's Spider-Man. The Spider-Man trilogy in the MCU, I know not everyone has loved what they have done with this character. I know not everyone has loved this trilogy. But for me, at the heart of it, it is the most consistent of them all. And specifically, the character arc that we get with Spider-Man. Every time I've ever seen, like, Civil War, Infinity War, even Endgame, where Tom Holland has shown up in, his character doesn't really get an arc in those. They're fun. They're fun to see Spider-Man in Avengers films. This is the one trilogy that, again, kind of has that nuance because it's Sony, where all the main character development very much happens in these films. And they're very important. Whether you look at Spider-Man Homecoming and his relationship between him and Tony Stark. Now, again, I know these films sometimes gravitate because, you know, of course, you look at Homecoming, it takes place after Civil War. If you don't watch Civil War, you might be losing out on certain things. If you watch Far From Home, if you don't watch Endgame, there might be some elements that you are losing out on there. And No Way Home's pretty safe on its own. But if you start with Homecoming, and then you go from Far From Home, and you get to No Way Home, by the end of that trilogy, that is technically this version of Peter Parker's story. His origin story, which is fascinating to see that this is the way that the MCU, and I don't know if they actually planned this, I honestly don't think they did, but the way that they actually use this as a crux to be his origin story, compared to where we go and visit Tobey Maguire, Andrew Garfield, and their origin stories all are in like the first 30 to 45 minutes, or technically just that first movie. That's what's fascinating to me, is that they took a trilogy and by the end of it made it Peter Parker's story. No Uncle Ben. They switched that out with Aunt May. We still get with great power comes great responsibility. We get Spider-Man and Tom Holland's Peter Parker really much learning how to grieve, how to become this, and really much feeling that loss now in his life. of everything. I mean, that is one of the most powerful endings that we could have seen. I really hope Spider-Man 4 does not erase that, because this will probably drop this down a peg if they do. And I say that. I know this is a trilogy, but that next one will really drop that down. I love what they did in Homecoming, establishing him as just this kid in high school, how that is going, how he's trying to balance it all. Far From Home takes him out of the country, adds a relationship into his life, builds in a character who could be his next mentor, and ends up being a fucking douchebag within Mysterio. Love Mysterio myself. And then diving into No Way Home, which is kind of the way, a celebration of Spider-Man in live action movies, with Tobey, Andrew, and of course Tom all showing up in there and getting this big film that contains some of the best Spider-Man moments of all time. This is the trilogy that consists the most of what a character is, and as someone who is a major Spider-Man fan, Spider-Man is my favorite superhero of all time. It's Spider-Man and Batman. This is the trilogy that I really want. I was very excited to see how they were able to accomplish that. And so with that said, that takes the cake. Thank you so much again, guys, for watching this. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe and comment down below your guys' thoughts. I can't wait to hear what your guys' thoughts are on this MCU trilogy and where you guys would rank it. So make sure to leave those. And thank you so much again for watching. So of course, until next time, stay classy.